So today I'm going to talk about how I found music in the 70s and the 80s. Well before the internet happened, we had this sort of word of mouth was definitely a big way of finding music. Just friends and groups or whatnot. Gave up basically on the radio by that time. Had the radio in the car, of course. Didn't have a cassette player in the car or anything, or an 8-track. Never had an 8-track player. So there was always the hits on, and I mean there was good songs in the 70s on the radio, but I was looking for a little more. I was looking for basically albums during the 70s and the 80s. 80s it was hard. So a lot of references at that time were Rolling Stone magazine. This is from 81, of course, after. But during the 70s I bought a lot of Rolling Stone magazines, and you could take them for what they were worth. I mean, you know, they could take them for a grain of salt, but they did have record reviews in them. And this is from 2003, well after the fact, when the internet was going strong or starting. So 500 top greatest albums of all time. Whatever, you can take it for what it's worth. So somewhere along the line, close to the end of the 70s, I guess, at that time it was, I think there were more, it was more the magazines. There's a little documentary on Rolling Stone that came out a few years ago, and there was Cream magazine, which I bought a lot. It was a little more irreverent, and it was always good for a laugh. A lot of interesting stuff in it, and that's a documentary on Cream magazine. It was pretty wild in those days back then when that magazine was going. And of course we had, I don't know if you can see it there, 16 magazine. Oh, that was always a big record review. No, not really, I'm just kidding. It's got a lot on the Partridge Family and the Osmonds. Look, you can even sing along to Partridge Family songs with David Cassidy. Oh, I got this at a yard sale. I put it on my wall as a joke, but it's a great one. 16 magazine. This is from 72. Oh, wow. So eventually, near the about 78, I think this book came out right here. This is the Encyclopedia of Rock. And it covered, I even got some albums that I was looking for at the time. I know there was one here I just saw, and it was, I had the Bizarros, I don't know what, Susie and the Banshees, Point Blank, Southern Rock, Wire, Pierre Rubu, the Buzzcocks, Jules and the Polar Bears. These were some of the things I was looking for near the end of the 70s, I presume. So this book was pretty good for as a guide. It had sort of the discography of bands up until basically 78. So it had pictures and whatnots in it. And there's another piece of paper. And that's got a bunch of Zappa stuff on it. So I used that as a guide. And I was into country music in the 70s. And this came out just probably after the rock one or at the same time. So I had Encyclopedia of Country Music. So I was into the old country at that. Well, it was old country, although the 70s offered up the outlaw country and whatnot, and I was into that quite a bit. So that was my history of little bit of history of country music, and I was also into a little bit of jazz at the time. So I had the history of the Illustrated Encyclopedia of Jazz. So I did listen to a little bit of jazz at that time. A lot of people were started selling their records in the 70s, so you could pick up a lot of albums real cheap. So I tried out a lot of different stuff then from friends and whatever, and garage sales were going pretty strong. So then at the end of the 70s, early 80s, we started getting record guides. This is the Rolling Stone record guide. And it's just chock full of record reviews and discographies, and I think they used the, I don't know if it was the 5-star or the 4-star method here. It doesn't really matter. You could take it for what it was worth. I mean, some bands were, you could say, oh, that might be a good album. And some bands you could say, well, they say it's a crappy album, but sometimes it's a good album. So you could go with this as just as a grain of salt. And Chris Gow, I sort of listened to him a little more. He sort of had a little more reputation as being, you know, a little more open-minded to a lot of different forms of music. So this is his record guide. Rock albums of the 70s. So that came in handy when I was looking to fill up discographies of bands from the 70s and sort of more obscure things. And also this came along too. This is kind of an obscure book. I found it in a used place. And it has a discography of bands and numbers of albums and stuff, so original albums. So there was a lot of different things in here that you couldn't really find too many other places. So I use this as a reference, and it's really falling apart now. So that is just a little, just a quick little video on how I found music in the 70s and 80s, especially the 80s. It was hard to find rock music in the 80s, all the synthesizers and stuff. And I mean, I did buy a few albums at the time by various bands that did that kind of music, but I don't have them anymore. And if I had to do a best of the 10 best of the 80s, I might have a hard job, although I probably could. I just haven't really thought about it. I mean, I have albums by the Dead Kennedys and Dream Syndicate and bands like that, but you had to dig deep to find music in the 80s. So, so long. That's my little blurb on the on how to find records in the 70s and 80s. Don't have to worry about that anymore because the internet really helped on that, you know, and with streaming and uploading, downloading, or whatever the hell you want to call it. And I gotta admit, I did that too. After I purged all my most of my records in the late 90s, early 2000s, I downloaded a lot of stuff. I had a couple hundred CDs that were all done from those downloads, and I got rid of most of them. I had a ton of Grateful Dead concerts, and one day I just looked at them and said, I'll never listen to all those. So I kept a few of the better ones, and on we went. Music.